The Rant Podcast is brought to you by CubsInsider.com. Welcome to The Rant. Welcome to The Rant, everybody. I'm John Furlease, a co-host of this show we call The Rant, and I am joined by my co-host, Evan Altman. Hi, Evan. How are you?
Oh, well, I'm something, I guess. I'm here. I'm looking outside. It's all we're getting snow again, so it's it feels like winter, which is just awesome, I guess. And then hey, we're a week out from CubsCon, so I've been there before when it's been super blustery and cold, so it's putting me in that kind of a mood. I guess it is nice to actually have kind of the hub of Cubdom coming into Chicago at the kind of the low point of the off season. And so, yeah, so I guess I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah. They'll be joined by Sammy Sosa and Kyle Tucker. So that's exciting.
Yeah.
Jed Hoyer. And I'm sure the Ricketts family will do a panel this year. I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Maybe they'll be on there with Ryan Dempster or something again. I know, it's still hilarious to me that they try to kind of pass that off as like, oh, we took surveys. People said it was boring. I'm like, you did it first thing in the morning on Saturday, dude. Everybody's hungover. like what? That's why nobody's there. You know what I mean? It was like the first thing was like 9 or whatever, but that's still, that's pretty early for people who've been out with the revelry, and but it was like all when the PR was going negative on them, then they were like, oh, we're not going to do it. Then they sort of brought it back, and then it was like, oh, well, we'll show up to, off the mound with Ryan Dempster presentation that night. It's like, okay, well, whatever you need to do to justify not really addressing people and whatever. I can't complain too much, but yeah, we'll see. We'll see how everything goes. I'm looking forward to getting the full schedule and seeing how that thing all breaks down.
It should be fun. I wish I was going to be there. I'm going to be at a baseball tournament my son is in Las Vegas, outside of Las Vegas. So, but I live in Phoenix, so it's not like I'm going to be going to nicer weather. It's usually just a little chillier there. It's cold here. It's the high is like 55 here. And I know a lot of people hear that and they're like, oh, that's pretty warm actually. But for us, it's a little chilly, not too bad. Enough to have a fire in the fireplace, I guess. Yeah. Getting down into the 30s. That's cold. But let's talk about, I think, the main topic that we probably should be discussing today, but maybe we won't spend all our time on it. But it's that the Cubs did not reach an agreement with Kyle Tucker on a contract in their arbitration, kind of $2.5 million apart. Cubs come in at $15 million. Kyle Tucker comes in at $17.5 million. Either one of those numbers is really a good deal for Kyle Tucker's productivity. What are you thinking about this?
I mean, there's a couple different angles on it, right? And everybody, not everybody, a lot of folks have definitely run with the, oh my God, no, the Cubs have shown they're cheap and now Tucker will never sign an extension with them. It's like, okay, let's step back from the ledge, right? Let's put down the crazy pills. Yes, the optics of it are bad from the outside, and fans who have watched the Cubs, fail to pay market value for star players. And they look at this and see another example of the same thing. But at the end of the day, this is probably just a big giant nothing burger, right? All the filing means it's an administrative thing, right? Because the league needs to have all this stuff figured out so they can set up the potential arbitration hearings. That's the whole point of this, right? Is that just like with anything else, that if you had a bunch of different things that you had to set up, a bunch of different tasks, what would you do? Would you want, let's say your wife and kids, say you got to go to the grocery store. Do you want to just show up to the grocery store and have everybody hand you their lists and then you go shopping like all at once? Or would you rather have that stuff in advance so that you know what you need to get? Obviously, it's the latter. right? The league wants to have its list of where it needs to go. They also want to have the numbers because, as folks out there may be aware, right, teams and players can settle. Once you get to that arbitration setting, they both file at a certain number, as you just laid out, the numbers the Cubs and Tucker laid. Because if it goes to arbitration, that arbitrator does not then arbitrarily assign a value. One side or the other wins. So if they do this and it goes to arbitration, either Tucker will get 17.5 or he'll get 15. That's it. So that's why those numbers are there. The two sides can still negotiate all the way up until the arbitration hearing on either a 1-year deal or a multi-year extension. So this does nothing at all to prevent the Cubs and Tucker from reaching an agreement before arbitration. It does nothing at all. It really does nothing in light of an extension, because again, this is just a matter of people looking at it and saying the Cubs are cheap and extrapolating that. Now, if you want to say the fact that they came in low, below what his projections were and below what his number was for a player of this caliber, for whom they just traded 3 players, right? One of whom could have been their starting third baseman and one of whom could have been the third baseman of the future. And you say, well, they're lowballing him for that. This makes him look cheap to me. Yes, totally understand it. And if you also extrapolate that and say them apparently being cheap here means they are not going to be willing to pay him what it takes to extend him, I can agree with that logic. But do not make the mistake of saying this means Tucker's camp believes the Cubs are cheap and they will absolutely not do an extension with them. Those are apples and elephants.
Well, and so the optics are bad. There's no question about it. I also don't think that either side cares nearly as much about the optics as the fans do. Right. Like, and so there's like a lot of different kind of perceptions that happen around something like this. I think, if you're the Cubs and if you're Kyle Tucker's camp, your perception is significantly different than Joe Cubs fan. And so there's that part of it. And I also tend to think like, is this kind of like the Cubs trying to leverage in future negotiations? Is it gamesmanship? Or maybe are they working on an extension, and this is just a way to kind of kick the can down the road until they do that. I mean, it's hard to think based on what we've seen from the Cubs in the past that they're going to come up with an extension with Tucker. I think that'd be a reason to celebrate. I think if they could do something like that, that'd be great, particularly if it was an extension that didn't involve a no trade clause. But it's very difficult to think that something like that gets done just based on their track record. So, maybe they're just trying to set the environment for future negotiations so that, both sides kind of know, how each side feels, but it's clunky. It's really clunky. I'll say, we're, to your point where you trade 3 players, pretty significant pieces for somebody who has, is such a great player, comes in as the best offensive player on the Cubs right now as it stands. And then you can't reach an agreement in arbitration for the guy. And it's I guess it's part of the whole deal, and not knowing how it ends makes it easy to like look at and criticize. But I think we just need to be patient and see how this turns out.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things at play here to me too, right? The first of which is like they just traded for this dude last month, right? A few weeks ago. So it's not as if there's any built-in. I mean, does his agent or his reps, do they know some of the guys in the Cubs front office a little bit? Does Tucker know some guys on the Cubs? Have there been, certainly some conversations? Yeah, but I mean, we're talking about. I mean, think about, back in the day. It's been 20 years or more for me, so it's difficult to remember like actually trying to date or anything like that, or like meet women. But if there was like a little bit of a I don't know, maybe everything's not perfect at a certain dinner, you know, but hey, you find this person very attractive. There's some good qualities there.
Like where you're
Having
going.
one awkward dinner is not going to prevent you from going out on another date with them. If
But it feels like,
many
to
other
me, it feels
things,
like if we're going to stick with that analogy, it feels very much like the Cubs found their girl. They've wanted this girl for a while. They get her to say yes to go on a date, and then when they're on the date, as the date is ending, they say, let's just go Dutch.
yeah, yeah. There's, I
You
mean,
pay your portion, I'll
yeah,
pay my portion.
no,
And you're
there,
kind of like, really? I
yeah.
mean, you wanted this so badly, and now you're just going to screw it up?
But then I also look at this. The other thing I will look at and say, and absolutely agree with you that their track record says there's nothing in their track record to make us believe that they'd be willing to ostensibly double the largest contract in franchise history. Jason Hayward's 184 million, which even doing that might not be enough for Tucker as right. I mean, we're talking 360, 370 million. That might not be enough given how good. And here's the thing about Tucker is he has toiled in relative obscurity down in Houston because they've had so many. I mean, look at all the guys. Look at George Springer and Carlos Correa and Alex Bregman and Jose Altuve. And I know now I'm forgetting somebody. Man, it's killing me. Anyway, I know I'm forgetting at least, but like Tucker is not the top dude you would think about when you look at the Astros players in terms of notoriety and everything else. And yet, you look at the numbers he's put up, and they are outstanding, right? We're talking a top 10 hitter in baseball since he came into the league as a regular, or since he became a regular. Really, his first two seasons were kind of spotty. So, all that said, I do also look at it and say, would they really make this move? And I talked about the give that they had earlier. Would you make the move for this guy with 1 year of control left, knowing that you had zero intention of being able to meet what you knew was going to be a monster extension? Would they really do that? And Jed Hoyer's only on the 1 year as well. Like, is it just a matter of him trying to buy himself personally enough more time? And I'm not saying they went into it knowing they could extend Tucker.
Yeah, I hope not.
Right. Which would be pretty wild. But I have to think because we can look at all these things, and I go back, and I probably mentioned this on another one. You look at Hoyer's quote, and I'm just going to paraphrase. He's like, we have not been in the market for these types. He's talking about Juan Soto, for these types of players to this point, but that doesn't mean we won't be in that market. It doesn't preclude us from doing these big deals with the right player. And to me, Tucker was the guy they identified as the right player. And to that end, no sooner had the news come out that, like, yeah, he's going to be available, or he isn't unavailable, then the Cubs immediately like jumped to the front of the line, got aggressive, and landed him. And I have a real tough time, as tough a time as I have seeing this regime between ownership and front office doing a deal in excess of 300 million. I have an even tougher time believing that they would have done this trade without any intention of even trying to extend him, right? Like, so therein lies the paradox. Like, which of those two things do you put more credence in? And I can tell you, based on the replies that I've gotten on social media, that most of the folks are adamantly in favor of, I guess, not that they want this to happen, but would vote that the Cubs have no intention of paying what it'll take. I struggle with that, man, because I think this is one of those where they were like, you look at Jed Hoyer's value matrix of what he likes in players and what these players bring and how that all makes sense. And I feel like Tucker is a dude that they identified who fit in there, who's going to be able to give them monster production without the same sort of contract that Ohtani or Soto or guys like that have commanded recently.
Yeah, I mean, The Cubs have certainly, they go for the value kind of signings for some reason. God knows why they do that. And it feels like, with Tucker, like, flying under the radar, as you mentioned, in Houston, not really a big name guy. Like, most people don't know who Kyle Tucker is. Like, maybe that's where they're trying to come at with this. If they were looking at an extension, is trying to get like kind of that, higher value per war scenario. Like, maybe, kind of like you felt like they did that with Dansby Swanson. Well, at least for the first year, maybe not the second year. But it felt like that's kind of the signing they got when they signed Swanson. And it feels like maybe that's what they're trying to do. It wouldn't be a surprise if they were trying to, get this value out of signing Tucker to what would be, probably an under market deal.
Can I throw out maybe I don't think it's a conspiracy, but it's something you had kind of alluded to, and I want to unpack it a little further. Is it possible? So we know a lot of guys do not like to negotiate during the season at all, right? Like, once camp opens up, they're like, nope, I'm not. Anthony Rizzo was that way. Chris Bryant was kind of, and that's kind of more of a Boris thing. But a lot of guys are like, I just want to focus on baseball. Like, once the season starts, that's what happened. And now I'm kind of setting this up poorly, because that means you could still negotiate throughout spring training and all that stuff. But I do wonder if this is almost a way to, I don't want to say force, but how about facilitate negotiations on something bigger? Because, again, very finite period of time that they had between the acquisition and the filing deadline, right? And so could they have reached an agreement? Yeah, but if that happens, then okay, well, we've the salary set, and there's no reason for us to talk money for this. There's nothing kind of hanging over it. There's no sort of Damocles. There's no timer on it, so to speak. But by failing, quote unquote, to reach an agreement, they trigger this, and maybe they're doing the file and trial, I should say, right? Where some teams do that, they're going to file their number, and they're just going to wait it out and take it to the arbitration table with no intention of negotiating with the player in between. The Cubs generally don't do that, right? But and they generally have done a good job of reaching agreements. Most notably, and I kind of screwed up the details on this, like Ian Happ, they failed to reach an agreement with him, and a lot of that was on his end. And I think him kind of wanting to win one, and he did, and he won his salary arbitration, and then he ended up signing a 3-year extension shortly after that, right? So it's like, again, this does not preclude anything, but I just wonder how much of it is like, rather than just saying, yeah, cool, we'll give you 16-6 or 17 or whatever, and then that's done. This gives them the impetus to continue negotiating, not only on his 2025 salary, but possibly what kind of opportunities are out there on an extension. It forces that, in effect, kind of like going to counseling or something like that. I don't know. And maybe I'm reading too much into this and trying to like grasp for straws, but Jed Hoyer is a smart guy, right? A lot of people think he's an idiot for whatever reason, because they don't like the way that he's built a team or the way he has spent the money that's been allocated to him from the payroll. But when we look at his negotiating, the things that Hoyer does really, really well are presenting and recruiting, right? Doing the behind the scenes stuff. When we talk about, again, the Hap negotiation kind of came together to us from the outside seemingly very quickly. No one knew about the council deal while that was going on. Shota Imanaga was in Chicago the whole offseason, and no one knew the Cubs had even met with him until they signed him, right? And so I look at those things. Like, a lot of people are going to look at the public stuff, right? The Cubs never give anybody this money. This is how they operate. I look at some of the other ways that they have done things and the way Hoyer has leveraged deadlines and timing and those sorts of things in his favor when it comes to some of these negotiating and recruiting pitches. And I feel like there's more to it than simply we're going to be cheap and send this thing on to the next phase of this.
You got to hope so. Yeah.
I would,
and you have to hope so.
Yeah. Maybe I'm just, I'm feeling like I'm trying to blow sunshine up everybody's asses.
Well, I mean, it does, it is a curtain, that they could be hiding behind, right? I mean, it could just be trying to continue to have like open conversation and open negotiations between the Cubs and Tucker, whereas if they came to an agreement right away, to your point, the conversations pretty much end right there, right? That's like a kind of a clunky way to then continue conversations. It's like, hey, let's agree on a number. We're 16 million. All right, 16 million is good. And then that's kind of the end of the conversations, right? Or I mean, like, do you continue to have the conversation? And in this particular situation, it does require both sides to continue to talk. And so from that perspective, yeah, maybe. I mean, I would hope that that's not why the Cubs are doing it, but I wouldn't be surprised if perhaps it is. But then to me, if that is what they're doing, boy, they better come up with a multi-year extension here, because otherwise it's just a disingenuous approach in my eyes to arbitration, where you're not really seeking to solve the problem that's in front of you. You're really trying to use it as leverage for an extension.
Yeah, and if they do, like, the thing about all this, and I referenced that earlier with Hap going to the table, and for those who aren't familiar, and I assume most of our listeners kind of get it, but you got to understand, like, the arbitration process is cutthroat, because you've got one side, the player side, arguing for why they deserve the money that they filed at, whereas the team then has to tell this arbitrator and try to convince them. And these are normally people who are not very baseball savvy, right? So like the team is going to find every counting stat or bad number they can come up with to throw it out there and tell this arbitrator why this player is not worth the money that they want. And it can get really contentious, right? It's pretty nasty. Now we could talk about it being a business and everything, but like that's part of the reason Corbin Burns is no longer with the Brewers. You know what I mean? Like, obviously it's because they didn't want to pay him up, but like you look at his quote, because this happened with him. They went to arbitration and he had the hearing, and it was like over Valentine's weekend. So like he had to fly, instead of being with his wife on Valentine's, he had to like fly to New York or wherever it is that they do the hearing and do all this. And it was a really shitty situation for him personally, right? Yeah. Not only professionally. And so if you do something like that, there's and again, let's go back to the analogy before. I'm sure. So you and I have both been married for many years, and there are going to be occasional spats with your spouse, but you're able to not easily every time, but there's enough built up capital, investment in the relationship that kind of a thing ideally does not send you spiraling. But if we are talking about a relationship that's very new and fragile, the chances of some kind of an otherwise maybe innocuous little thing, or some little, idiosyncratic tweak that they've got, and it just, you're like, nope, can't deal with this, and you're out, because there's no investment there. Similarly, this is the kind of thing where there is no relationship, or virtually no relationship. And so to start this new relationship out on the terrible foot of having to present why this person that you just traded 3 players for, who is the best player on your team, and now you're going to have to go before an arbitrator and tell this guy why this player actually is not good. That, to me, would cause a big problem in terms of the extension thing, right? That's like
the, to go back to the analogy of dating someone, that's like looking at someone and saying, I love you, but there are these things that I don't like about you.
Yeah. Let me give you a list of things I don't like.
You are my dream girl, but I've got this other thing happening.
Well,
There's no success in that approach.
Yeah, well,
there's none.
Have you seen the movie She's Out of My League?
Comedy
kind of. Okay. So like the smoking hot chick, right?
Good comedy.
She's dating kind of the goofy looking dude. What's his name? Jay Baruchel.
Yeah,
and
not very realistic.
Alice Eve. No, not at all. Like this would never happen. And she's like, and she's just stupid hot. And then she's talking to him about, well, my one little defect that I'm super self-conscious about. And he goes freaking out about it. And he thinks she's got, like, who knows, like a third leg sticking out somewhere or whatever. Maybe she's a dude. I don't know if he goes that far, but it ends up being like she's got like a funky looking little pinky toe, right? But he has now perseverated over this. And it's like, again, similarly to take that. So now you're like all of a sudden like what you said. And now you're going and saying, hey, you're the best player on our team, but well, you had that shin problem that kept you out for like half the time. Those first 2 seasons, it took you a little while to catch your footing, and that wasn't really good. And we don't really. Oh, look at this play you made or didn't make. Here's this error, and you're bringing up all these little things to where now that person is going to be hearing all this stuff, and it's going to get in their head. They're like, dude, screw you. Like, I'm not going to sit here and listen to this. I don't want to be
anymore.
And I would look at that, and actually, this leads me into another example on the other side of this. Look at how things worked with Juan Soto, and a lot of the reason he gave for leaving New York was that he didn't feel like ownership treated him well and truly valued him, right, and wanted him to be there as a person more than just a baseball player. And that's part of what, obviously, getting $765 million is a huge part of it, but he was going to get generational wealth regardless. And now I will flip that and say, everybody's saying that the Cubs, quote unquote, lowballing Tucker is going to prevent him from ever signing an extension. I would go to the other extreme and say, what are the 2 largest arbitration salaries in baseball history? The last 2 are Juan Soto got like whatever it was, $31 million last year from the Yankees. The year prior, Shohei Ohtani had gotten $30 million from the Angels. Did either of those 2 players remain with those teams once that final arbitration season was over? No, they did not. And so we could talk about how the Cubs doing this with Tucker unequivocally rules out an extension. I would say that even if they had said, hey, Kyle Tucker, here's $20 million. We're going to go 2.5 above your ask. That by no means guarantees or even gets them closer to the conversation of having an extension. So if overpaying him doesn't get them closer to one, underpaying or undervaluing does not do anything to harm their chances of it. This is all about their willingness. I guarantee you, if they just said, here's 10 years, $400 million, I don't want to guarantee it, but if they were willing to do that, I think he would sign. So this is not a matter of whether Kyle Tucker was offended by this, because he is not. His team understands how this works. Nor is it a matter of the Cubs being cheap because they gave, it was $15 million. The optics, again, are bad from the outside, from fans looking at this and doing so without maybe enough nuance. But when it comes to the nature of this whole thing, whether or not he is able to be extended has everything to do with whether the Cubs are willing to pay the money that is enough to keep him, and then whether he is willing to do that and potentially take off the table maybe more money if he has an MVP caliber season in Chicago at his age and knowing what the other contracts are. The flip side of that is he could get hurt, he could have a crappy season and lose a ton of money relative to what that extension might be. So again, what happened yesterday with the arbitration filing means nothing versus the Cubs' willingness and Tucker's willingness to discuss a long-term extension. That means everything. And that part of it is not impacted one way or the other by anything that happened on Thursday.
Yeah. Well, I mean, either way, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Hopefully something develops within the next week before CubsCon. I'm going to be real surprised if it doesn't. So we'll kind of see how that plays out. Keeping on the topic of arbitration eligible players and contracts, the Cubs extended several contracts through the arbitration process, one of which was Justin Steele, which is, pun intended, a steal at $6.5 million. And like, I just wanted to touch on this because to me, like, if you look at Steele's numbers over the past, just the past couple of years, you look how he did last year. Now, of course, he was injured last year, but his ERA, he had a decent ERA, but it was the first year that his ERA was actually higher than his FIP, except for his first year, which was 2021. And so if you look at his FIP and compare it, it's a little higher. He also, his Ks per nine were down, his walks per nine were up, and his ground ball rate was significantly worse at 44.8% versus around 50% in the prior 3 years. And so his numbers, they were still good. I'm not saying Justin Steele is not a good pitcher, but what I am saying is that if you look at how he performed last year compared to his first 3 years, it feels like it took a little bit of a dip. Not saying that's going to be a trend. There was the injury there. And so you don't know what's going to happen this year. He still has 2 more years of arbitration left. I mean, to me, and maybe the Cubs are still going to do this feels like the time you go out and extend him, right? Like, I mean, a little dip in his productivity, injured last year. You're never going to get a better deal for the guy. Buy out his final 2 years of arbitration. I mean, that feels like something like the D-backs would do with Justin Steele. And I think if the Cubs are going to present themselves as this kind of value-oriented team, I mean, am I missing something?
No, I mean, this has been a topic that's out there. A lot of people have theorized, like, and for the last couple of years, really, like, Steele has proven himself. I mean, he still had, he was injury prone early in his career, and we've seen him come up. He's had the forearm strain, he's had some other little issues. He had the hamstring, 2 outs or 2 innings or whatever it was into the game. I was there, now I can't remember it, but way too early, 2 innings, I guess, right in the opening day start in Arlington. But he's continued to put up. I mean, if you look at his numbers, and they're super consistent, right? The guy, he's excellent. He's still got room for improvement, and I wrote a little bit about that recently. A couple things that I think he could maybe tweak slightly, and I think there's potential for that. But this is one of those where it's like the Cubs can easily make that case because he doesn't have like the eye popping. He's not striking out 14 guys per 9. He's not getting a 2.2 ERA or anything like that. He has had some injuries that have limited his overall production, and he's still at such a low contract rate that you could, as you mentioned, buy out those years. And this is where the value-based stuff comes in, right? And push him out maybe another 3 to 4 years. So, you extend him, and maybe you give him a 5-year extension, right? Because what's he at now? What's his age?
I think he's like 28.
I was going to say 27, 28.
He is, I'm on his page. I just can't find where it says his age. 29 years, 5 months.
Okay. So last year was his age 28 season. This will be his 29 season.
Yeah, his birthday's in July.
So you do that. You ride with his salary for now. The new money starts next year, and maybe that's, I don't know what it would take, 15 a year, right? Let's say it's 5 years, 75 million. Maybe it's,
oh God, that'd be such a bargain.
And
it'd have to be a little bit more.
It's probably got to be like 90. Let's say 5 or like 590 with maybe there's an opt out in there. Maybe there's a player option for a 6th year at like 25 million, something like that would take it over 100 if he gets there. And then you put some performance bonuses in there too, right? Like,
yeah, for sure.
We're hitting 150 innings, for getting a certain number of strikeouts, things like that, right? That can bring the value up, which are great. And I love those because it's like, hey, the player's got something to work toward, and the team doesn't have to take on that initial AAV toward their competitive balance payroll unless the player hits those benchmarks, in which case it will have easily been worth it. So I think something like that makes sense. And it fits it both ways. Like he locks up that long-term security. The Cubs get a top level, maybe he's not a true ace, but in terms of the staff, he's the number one or number two. You know what you're getting. You lock him in there. And he's a good dude who came up through the system. He's a homegrown player, a homegrown pitcher, no less.
Sends a positive message.
Yeah, it's a good look. I think there's a lot to like about that, and especially, and I think there's serious potential for him to get. I don't know about significantly better, because at a certain point, right, there's diminishing returns on improvement. Like how much more can you improve over what he's done? He's been excellent, but I really think if he figures out that changeup, then you talk about, again, the pun of it being a steal. And if he gets, because you just look at his numbers. Like the dude for his 3 full seasons, his 3 seasons as a starter, his ERA has varied by what, 11 hundredths of a percentage, or 11 hundredths of a point, right? His FIP has varied by 2/10 of a point. Like his strikeouts per 9 innings have varied by half a point. Like, who's that consistent? He's figured out the walks. He's dialed those down. He doesn't give up homers. He's a great fit for Wrigley. Like, it's a no-brainer to extend this guy. And and he could be so much better even.
To your point, he's not an ace, right? If he's your ace, then you're a 500 team, which the Cubs are.
Which they have been. Yeah, shocker.
But I'll tell you what, he is a great number 2/number 3 guy. Like if the Cubs can get to a point where they've got, a true ace, and then another guy that's competing to be the true ace, and then Justin Steele's your number 3, that's a team that can win a lot of games.
Yeah, and if you figure that out, and like I said, I'm fully convinced that he can. Like, I've shared. I won't get into the Cade Horton thing here again, and my kind of skepticism around that. But if Horton is who they think he could be, that's a dude who really could flash ace potential. Shota Imanaga came in and was just great out the gate. But again, he's another one. Like Imanaga and Steele are kind of like 1A, 1B for me right now. And yet
it's just the handedness, right?
Yeah, and they both should be 2 or 3, I think, on any, like, if you had, and again, that's saying something. Like I'm not taking anything. So I know people hear that and be like, blasphemer. But like, let's be honest. If you had a true lights out, we're talking, because remember, when the Cubs were 15-16, the Cubs had John Lester and Kyle Hendricks in their primes, and those were their 2 and 3 because they had Jake Arrieta. Yeah, right. So, exactly. So it's not taking anything away from Steele and Imanaga to say, boy, the Cubs could really do well with getting an ace type guy. We're talking about some high level stuff here, right? But that's what it takes when you're expecting to try to compete for a World Series. You get that dude, but again, I look at that a couple different ways. But I wonder, and could Steele get to that level? I don't know if it gets him there, but I think he could actually inch a little bit closer to that ace level if he can figure out the changeup. That's a pitch he's been tinkering with for the last 5 or 6 years at least, and it hasn't worked. He throws it very infrequently. He actually got decent results, on a very small scale. But I wrote about this the other day, and I think if he were, I'll full disclosure, I don't know if he's still throwing kind of the more traditional circle grip that he picked up from Cole Hamels when the two of them were, when Hamels was with the Cubs and they were kind of together there in spring training when Steele was still in the minors. I don't know if he's still throwing that, but I think, and nor do I know whether he is a natural pronator or supinator as far as his, again, so for those who maybe again don't know, pronation is, put your hand out there and turn it to the inside, right? Thumb going down. That would be pronating. And I'm even doing this out with my hand in front of me right now, and I'm doing it with my left hand so I can make sure I'm doing this right. Thinking about Justin Steele, and then supination would be thumb going up, right hand turning to the outside as you throw, and that's a natural thing. It's part of motor preferences. We could get into that if we have time, but who knows? And so normally, right, a traditional circle changeup, the thought is that you need to pronate it. In other words, again, have the thumb come down and get that side spin, which kills the overall rotation and slows the pitch down. However, if someone is a natural supinator and you're trying to effectively force them to go against their body's natural biases, the results may not be very good. I do not know whether Steele is one or the other. My supposition is that he is a supinator because he's got that cut ride fastball, right? If you're cutting the fastball, and again, you think about your four seam and you kind of put your two, your index and your middle finger up, and your thumbs to the inside, and you got your hand there. If you're cutting it, you're generally getting around it a little bit to the outside. From a left-hander, I'm getting around the outside of the ball a little bit, which is going to create more of that glove side movement, which is largely what Steele's fastball does. You got the cut ride, right? He's going to cut it or he's going to ride a little bit. And so that leads me to believe between that and having trouble with the changeup, which again, the way he throws it requires pronation, leads me to believe he's a supinator. And then if we listen to some of what Tyler Zombro, who's the Cubs' recent front office hire, who's a pitching expert, and he was saying that, the studies have shown that of all the guys who are natural supinators, 70% of them are still trying to pronate a changeup. So you've got 70% of supinating throwers who are trying to go against their body's preference and throw a pitch that's just not going to work for them. And so if Steele is actually doing that, which again, I don't know for sure. I know he was at one point. If he would just change to a two-seam orientation and then just throw the change like that, like get his change up, whether it's a kick change, which I've seen work really well with a lot of people, or just kind of just find a kind of a standard changeup grip and don't even worry about pronating. Just get a two-seam orientation and throw it. And if you cut it a little bit, cool, that'll still be good. But I think that could help him out tremendously as right now, and we've seen it. He mainly is a two-pitch guy. It's fastball slider. That's worked really well for him. But at a certain point, there's going to be times maybe the slider's not working as well. Maybe he's not feeling the fastball. Maybe something's off there. Maybe he just needs to be able to have a weapon that's going to help him a little bit more. Again, and his splits aren't bad, but that's going to help him getting more depth on that change, and being able to operate that better is going to help him against right-handed batters. So I look at this a couple different ways. If he can do that, and we talked about all the stats already, now all of a sudden we're talking about a guy who's maybe not a 3.06 or a 3.07 ERA. Maybe we're talking 2.9, 2.8, right? And the FIP gets below. I mean, the FIP's been 3.2, 3.02, 3.23. That all of a sudden, those have been very, very closely aligned with his ERA. So this is not a guy who relies on luck. The results are there. And I know I've rambled for way too long, but I just feel like if he's able to find that, it doesn't need to be a pitch he throws a ton, but if he's able to get that, throw that thing up to maybe 10% of the time, keep hitters off of some of this other stuff. Outside of finding that ace, paying for that ace, trading for that ace, maybe he develops that next step and can take it. But we'll see. And if that's the case, that extension we talked about would be hella worthwhile.
Exactly. And so when you look at, like, for example, John Lester, lefty, kind of same fastball velocity, kind of low, maybe mid 90s, but not quite. But Lester had 4 pitches, right? And that's really where you see guys become more successful, unless you're like Kyle Hendricks, who can just deceive batters and not overpower them. It feels like you're right. You need to extend that repertoire and at least add in one more pitch, because you're right. Right now he's a 2-pitch guy, 4-seam and the slider, and then the usage of the change and the sinker are just so low.
He'll throw a curve once in a very great while, and
2%. Versus a change of 3.
I would like to see that too, because his curveball is really slurvy, right? Like his slider gets more horizontal break than most lefties
Mm-hmm.
anyway. And he's got that, he's got a 45, 46 degree arm angle, right? And so really like the slider is actually normally like if you looked at a movement profile chart and looked at that circle, and then you take that pitcher's arm angle and just take that, extend from their hand, go down through their arm and just create a line, that's normally where you would want to see the pitches work on there. And I believe high slot supinators have a kind of a larger pitch repertoire available to them based on what they should be able to throw for, again, for their slot and their other personal biases. But if you look at Steele, he's a little weird because that cut ride fastball is very odd in that it does not operate like most people's do. Most right-handed pitchers, and you look at their fastball, it's going to be on that arm side of the plot. Again, I'm looking at a circle, right? 4 quadrants. A left-hander is going to be, again, up and left. Steele's is like dead center, right? Because and a lot of it is over to the glove side because, again, he cuts it. He gets high ride and some cut to it. So it's a very odd deal, and that's why it works well because it doesn't do what people expect. Similarly, his slider actually has less depth and more sweep than you would expect, especially coming from that arm slot because it's like right at the midway point, right through the center of the circle where you would normally expect it to be a little bit below coming from a higher slot like that. Whereas his curveball gets a lot more depth and sweep. And so again, we start talking about these things. And if he was able to get that changeup working a little bit more, again, to where it's getting a little bit more depth, but to the arm side, the curveball gets this great depth and is over to the glove side, you're looking at those two pitches making up only 5% of his repertoire. And again, that's where I'm like, man, if those could be like 5 to 10% each, 5% each, and maybe 10% total, so double that usage. It doesn't need to be a lot, but little things like that are going to help those other pitches play up. He's got such a weird profile, but I do think, again, just everything that I've seen with this tells me there's a lot more room for that changeup to be far more effective and thereby make what are already very, very effective pitches in terms of his fastball, right? 74th percentile for fastball run value, 84th percentile for breaking run value, but his off speed is 42%.
And so it makes me wonder if the Cubs believe or don't believe, as the case would be, that he can develop those secondary pitches. And so maybe that's why they're kind of standing pat. But the thing is that I'm assuming they're working on that with him, and we're going to find out, right?
I'm like, if I get the chance to pick his
Rosemont.
brain, yeah, I mean, I would love to hear more about that, find out about it. It's like, and I think, again, so I fully like, I'm a big drive line guy, big tread athletics guy. Tyler Zombro came from tread. 2 of the guys the Cubs have signed him. Well, I guess Festa's not a minor league deal. Ben Heller signed a minor league deal. They traded cash for Matt Festa. They're probably going to try to sneak him through waivers, but both of those guys are tread pitchers who have been through that system. So familiar to Zombro from that. But I think what they've got here is a guy where, and I've never heard any of this stuff from the Cubs at all on any level prior to Zombro coming in. And this is stuff that he talked about when he was with Tread. So he hadn't spoken about this specifically in relation to the Cubs. But when we talk about motor preferences, the things I was mentioning earlier, actually, let me do this. I know we don't have a ton of time, but I'm going to do a little experiment with you. Are your hands free? Can you use your hands right now?
My hands are free.
Okay. So I just want you to just cross your fingers.
Done.
Like, put now, uncross them and try to cross them the other way with the fingers over the other.
Not as good as that at that.
Right. Doesn't feel good. Doesn't. Now cross your arms.
Done.
Okay. Now take them and cross them the other way.
Super weird.
Feels weird, right? So we all have, that's just like super easy example, right? We're talking about motor preferences. There's a lot of different things here, but all of our bodies have specific ways that they just naturally want to move, right? The body itself is a compensation machine. We got bilateral movements, and there are, again, some people are left-handed, some people are right-handed. That's a simple way to look at it. But then we talked about pronation and supination. Are you an aerial mover or a terrestrial mover? And this is a big thing in baseball that I think could be revolutionary, because so often all we hear is, You got to get grounded. You got to get the ground force. You got to get low. You got to get, that's great for guys who are terrestrial movers who need to be grounded, draw their power and their movement from the ground up. But aerial movers, Matt Shaw is one, for instance. My son's an aerial mover. They want to initiate more from the top. So you have to do different things. I've written a ton about it with Matt Shaw. And so to bring this around more succinctly, and I actually will be getting 2 Amazon packages today, one of which has the motor preferences for baseball coaches book that I'm very interested to dive into. But the point here, and where Zombro is aware of this, now he doesn't specifically say motor preferences, but he's very, very well aware, and I've seen a lot of his videos, that pitchers are all individuals. All of them want to move differently. And so the repertoire needs to be based not on what you think a pitcher should throw or a lefty starter should throw or what have you. It's all about, and the Cubs are also employing, and now I can't remember, it's Next Base. I think it's a Tokyo-based company that studies, that works on injury prevention with pitchers, that's going to get in there and dive in during spring training, take all this up-close video and look at like finger pressure and different spin points and things like that, right? So they're digging into all this stuff. But what you end up with then is not just creating a repertoire based on what you think that pitcher should throw because of this, but by saying, oh, you're a supinator and here's your slot. These are the pitches that should work best for you. Here's how we can sequence those. Oh, you're a hitter, Matt Shaw, who's no one. Look at Matt. Anybody out there, if you haven't already seen it, go look. You can look at some of the stuff I've written. You can just find it online. Look at Matt Shaw's batting stance. There's no way in hell you would ever teach a kid to set up like that. His back toe is actually pointed a little bit slightly back toward the catcher. His front toe is pigeon-toed heavily. He's got a big leg kick, and then he strides with his front foot open about 45 degrees. The reason for that is, as an aerial mover and as an associated mover, which means he doesn't get a whole lot of separation between hips and shoulders. Another thing that could be revolutionary for baseball, because almost all preach to get this big hip shoulder separation. Not everybody's physically capable of doing that to the same extent. Shaw is not one of those. And so by having his front foot land open, he's able to clear his hips because he wants to start everything from the top. In order to do that properly, he's got to be able to clear his hips, because if he doesn't, and if he landed with that front foot closed or neutral, his hips would lock a little bit and he'd end up with what we would call a handsy or a top heavy swing, right? Similarly, I think with Steele, as I mentioned earlier, he's a guy who's a supinator. And so I think if he's been trying to pronate the changeup, that's not going to work. And I think it's one of those things, no detriment to the Cubs, or I'm not being derogatory to the Cubs, because I don't think most teams are completely well aware of this yet, that we just don't have this understanding. It's very European in its basis. Now it's taken hold over here. And I think Zombro is a guy who gets it, even if he doesn't use the same language. And by doing that, by kind of finding a couple little tweaks, you're allowing some of these guys, hitters and pitchers alike, to develop and maybe improve in ways that are more, first of all, that fit better how their body wants to move. And guess what? If you're doing the thing in the way your body wants to do it, it's going to be much, much easier to adopt. You're not fighting yourself. It's a more efficient improvement. And so that's where I would look. And we're probably talking about very, very incremental stuff, right? For professional athletes who have been doing this their whole lives and who have established themselves well. So we're not talking about Steele all of a sudden becoming, Jacob deGrom or something like that. But
his velocity is never gonna,
right? Like it's not just some unlock that you're like, oh, it's a worldly different player. But these are the things that I think, as good as the Cubs have been, and I think Tommy Hotovy has done a great job. I think Craig Breslow did a great job when he was in there. Carter Hawkins is a pitching guy. Jed Hoyer's really, they all get this, but I think there are some things that there's still some kind of old school ish, but that sounds derogatory, a little pejorative, more of like, we don't know what we don't know that's gone on, that I think has prevented the Cubs and most other organizations. It's not just the Cubs thing, most organizations, from fully being able to develop and maintain the development of a lot of players coming up through their system, whether it be at the minor league level or even at the majors, because they're trying to, again, follow a pattern that's been established as just understood, whether it be nomenclature or training methods or pitch selection, things like that are just, this is just the way it's always been. And I think there are some new thoughts that are going to be coming into the system now with Zombro and some others that could yield some really, really serious benefits, not only to the development at the lower levels, but even as some of these guys at the major league level continue to try to get better. So when Jed Hoyer talks about kind of the value adds and guys outperforming projections, Tyler Zombro is going to have a very big hand in that, at least from the pitching side of things, in my humble opinion, anyway.
Yeah, and you just so everybody knows, you can go to cubsinsider.com and check out the article that Evan wrote on cubsinsider.com, and there's a lot more information about Tyler Zombro and kind of, you know, his approach, and it's interesting stuff that I do
not
think,
for everybody. Let's throw it
really
out there.
Impact.
Yeah, if you're in the mood for a hamburger, this is more like probably a 7-course meal. Like it's, or maybe, you know, maybe it's just something a little heavier. I don't know. But really, and so yeah, so there's one that I have in there about like little tweaks for starters that I think each of them could make, and that harkens back to some of the Zombro stuff. And then there's another piece earlier about Zombro specifically, where then I dove into stuff on Steele and Jamison Tyon. Tyon, another Tread guy. Speaking of which, so Tyon has been at Tread this winter, working with Ben Brewster, who's the Tread founder, who follows me on Twitter, by the way. Shout out to Ben Brewster. Good guy who I originally kind of got into it with, and now we're cool. But it's very interesting to see a lot of these plays. That's why Tread keeps getting people poached. That's why Driveline keeps getting people poached, because their training methods and the things that they're doing are largely like they're all trying to prove themselves wrong. Whereas I think most coaches, I don't think this, I know this, most coaches and baseball organizations spend tons of time and money trying to prove themselves right. If that makes sense, right? Like,
yeah,
I'm going to use my system because my system works, and you're going to follow my system because it works. Whereas Tread and Driveline are saying, we hope we can prove ourselves wrong because we're trying to find the next thing that's better, and then the next thing that's better than that. And again, so you look at motor preference experts, go check out Matt Swope, who's the head coach at the University of Maryland, interestingly enough, where Matt Shaw went to school. And you look at things like Pelotero, which is a great hitting performance platform. There's all kinds of stuff out there that can help these players, because these things are being done agnostic from the egos and the kind of, I don't even want to say the money involved. Everybody wants to make money, but there's a ton of ego involved in coaching at the professional level, and general managers and presidents of baseball operations and all that stuff, because safety is the name of the game for those organizations. Whereas innovation and truly not being safe, not in terms of health, but just in terms of like they're not, Driveline's not just trying to cover their ass. Tread's not trying to cover their ass with the moves that they make, right? Which is decidedly different from kind of where Jed Hoyer needs to operate. And so as we get more and more of the thought leaders coming into Major League Baseball from these outside organizations, bringing in new ideas and concepts, we're going to see the game change. And I think the Cubs are in a good spot for that. And I hope it continues.
Yeah.
And I need to shut up because I'll talk about this forever. So,
well, no, I mean, that just goes to the whole kind of like the alternative approach, I would say. You know, it's like when you look out there, but it's hard for me to swallow to some extent. Like, I get totally everything that you're saying, but I think in terms of the Cubs, like, should they be doing this? Yes. Should this be the sole path that they're on to try to develop talent within the organization? No. Does it feel like it is? Kinda, you know?
yeah,
and so it's like, it feels like as a big market team, they should be doing, you know, that for sure. And I love that they're doing all this.
They should be doing
relying
both,
on this kind of new age data and approach, but there needs to be like kind of like those the other part of it that seems to be missing from a big market team.
They got to spend to raise the ceiling, or spend to raise the roof, and then use the data to raise the ceiling. But yes,
exactly. And so, you know, which would be kind of taking what the Rays have done and teams like that, and then amplifying it by adding a layer on top, which is the ability to spend big. It feels like that would be successful if you could combine the two. The Cubs just haven't done the first part of it as well as they are doing, the analytical kind of new age type stuff. One thing I wanted to touch on before we head out was just an article that you had posted about Pete Alonso and that Boris is seeking $200 million. And really the only reason I want to touch on this is that I don't think Pete Alonso, I mean, would I be happy if Alonso was with the Cubs? Yeah. I'm not sure where he'd play. I obviously he'd play first base, but then you've got Michael Busch, who I feel pretty good about in terms of the future. Younger guy, has some power. It's more around Scott Boras. And it's like, at some point, like it just feels like he's failed the last couple of years with his clients. And I mean, he's able to do certain things, but I think the shine or the allure of being a Scott Boras client feels to me like it's wearing off. Like he's really not being able to successfully do the things that like he thought he was successful and everyone thought he was able to do, which is those big, huge multi-year contracts. And it feels like he's getting kind of like outplayed a little bit by some of these teams the last couple of years. And I think Pete Alonso is a perfect example where he's coming out saying he wants $200 million. It just seems like he comes out with these unrealistic numbers. His players don't get signed. And then they have to like, take these really just shit deals that have options in them. And what happened with Bellinger and some of the other guys last year. I mean, like at what point is Boris gonna like kind of be put in his place, or has he already been?
I think once he dies, and I think he'll do this till he dies. I don't think this guy's gonna retire, but like, yeah, I mean, I really think he's lost his fastball, and that gets covered up a little bit by the Juan Soto stuff. But we knew, I mean, like Juan Soto sells himself, right?
That's
Scott
easy.
Boras didn't
That's like
go out there.
Yeah, I mean, that's like getting a big deal for Michael Jordan. I mean, not quite like that, but
It was very easy. But yeah, I mean, you look at Carlos Correa and the mess that happened with that. Look at Jordan Montgomery, right? We talk about the D-backs. Like Montgomery had to wait things out till spring training, got a 1-year deal.
Now look at where he is. Yeah, now look at where he is.
And they hate him there, and he hates being there. And there's no solution because they can't trade him because nobody's going to pick up his $25 million salary that he earned from making enough, going enough innings. And then he picked up his player option. So it's like, and we look at not only Alonso, but Alex Bregman supposedly wants a deal akin to that of Manny Machado's like 11-year, $300 million deal. Nobody's given Bregman $300 million. Nobody's given Alonso $200 million. I don't like Alonso at 5 years and $125 million personally, because as much as I like the power and it'd be great for the Cubs to have that kind of pop, as you said, like the Cubs have already got a Gold Glove level first baseman. Pete Alonso is not a Gold Glove level first baseman. He needs to be a DH. The Cubs already have a DH in Seiya Suzuki because they got a right fielder in Kyle Tucker. They got a first baseman in Michael Busch, who was more valuable or as valuable as Alonso, at least in terms of WAR, and should continue to outpace him just because of his overall production. So are you going to pay $25 to $30 million a year for a DH when that also means doing so would force you to part with Suzuki on a deal that would make him waive his no trade clause, which means you're limited in terms of the teams you can get him to? Like, none of it makes any sense to me, right? I get you. Somebody might I like the idea of Pete Alonso in a Cubs uniform if it wasn't for what the cost would be relative to the production and what else it would require from a personnel standpoint. Because if it means getting rid of Suzuki, well, now how much is it even a positive wash outside of raw power? And even that's not a huge difference, honestly, with where they've been lately between Alonso and Suzuki. Like, if you get Alonso, you lose Suzuki and you're paying more money now overall. Like, I can't see any way to make that calculus work. And
there's not.
Again, and that's assuming like just a 1 year, like, I don't know if I want this dude well into his 30s, who appears to be on the decline. I feel the same way about Corbin Burns. And the same thing about Alex Bregman. Like, everybody's, the Cubs can go get Bregman. They save this money on Bellinger. But I'm like, again, the puzzle pieces. This is part of the problem that Jed Hoyer has. We talked about this before. You create a roster that is full of a bunch of dudes who are pretty good, and but then where's the value? Can you move them? And if you do, what are you losing versus what you're gaining? And so there's a whole lot going on there. So yeah, I don't like the idea. I don't like the idea. Of like signing Alonso to a big deal, period. Let alone with all the other things. A lot of people would disagree with me. So whatever.
Yeah, and that was my intent. Was let's just put this to bed, shall we? Because Alonso, to your point, I mean, Michael Busch had a 3.6 WAR last year, which was higher than Alonso, was 2.1. And I mean, that's coming from 4.7 in his rookie year. So he's been on the decline. 2.8 WAR 2023, 2.1 last year. Seiya Suzuki's WAR last year was 2.3. I'm sorry, Michael Busch was 2.3. My bad. Seiya Suzuki was, I got my pages mixed up. Seiya Suzuki was 3.6. So Seiya Suzuki, who is your DH really for all intents and purposes, has a higher WAR. He's getting on base at a higher clip. Yeah, he's not hitting as many home runs, but the potential's there. 21 home runs last year. You could see that getting close to 30. And so yeah, to me, like Pete Alonso just doesn't fit into the calculus in any way, shape, or form for this Cubs team. And so hopefully, this Boris wanting $200 million or whatever he wants, the crazy number he's trying to get. And the fact that when you look at the Cubs team as is currently constructed, you're certainly not going to trade away Michael Busch. That just wouldn't make sense to do without knowing what his potential is and where his ceiling lies. For a guy who's 27 years old, just turned 27, it's just that wouldn't make any sense. And so I don't see room for Alonso on the team, and I certainly hope that most Cubs fans agree.
They better. They know what's good for them.
They better. So on that note, I think that's a good note to sign off on. We will head on out and we'll come back. Well, let's see what happens for Cubs convention. You're going to be there on Friday.
Yes.
And so what is it? What's the place you guys go to?
Lizzie McNeil's.
Lizzie McNeil's. If you guys want to meet Evan, go to Lizzie McNeil's on Friday evening.
Somebody from Facebook might be listening. I might get my ass kicked.
Yeah.
One of the people I pissed
off. There'll be other bloggers and some of the beat writers usually are there too. So it's usually it's a fun night. I've made it there. I'm not going to make it, like I said, this year, but should be a good time. And we'll see. Maybe we'll circle back if anything happens. We just I like the how we're approaching the podcast. We don't really have a day that we're doing it on. We just kind of do it when we feel like it's right and we have enough time. And so
it's a spontaneous little present for you.
Yeah, because we're not getting paid, a significant amount of money to do it. It feels like something we should do whenever we feel like it.
I don't know about you. I'm not getting paid anything to do it. So I maybe feel like you're holding out on me now. That's like
it's all effort.
Yeah, I get paid in attaboys and people saying we need to put it back on video. So which I understand, but I will admit that
people actually want to look at us talk.
Yeah, which is weird. But I think part of it was like when it was live and they could kind of interact, and I get that, but then I ramble badly enough as it is, let alone when there's comments coming up that I'm trying to read. So I get it.
Maybe someday.
Yeah, who knows?
Until then, thanks for joining us, everybody. It's been real. And we're out. See ya.